Hello, everyone. I hope I'm coming through. I had my usual technical glitches getting started, but I can, I can assure myself I'm online right now. I think I'm online right now. I can see people in the chat. Hello, good to see everyone here already. Um, Parijat Chakraborty, Jayeska, Rosin, Ashwita is in the chat moderating. Edward, good to see you. Abhinav, hi from Bangalore. Hello. UK checking in. Yes, I love to hear where everyone is from. This is something that I really enjoy at the beginning of live stream, just seeing all the different places people are joining the live stream. So please go ahead and leave it in the chat. I'm just going to give people a couple of minutes to catch up, and also to make sure that I'm actually set up for this live stream. It's a little last second. Hear you from Chicago. Good to see you, TA. Donovan, Sudu Mudu. Hello, good to see you. Donovan, good to see you. All right, Donovan's asking about which comics made the cut. Surprisingly, and this was really a remarkable thing, everything I showed in those two videos, everything in those two videos made it home. There were a couple of other things that didn't, but somehow, and of course it had to do with my mother's generosity with giving us some of her luggage allowance. Otherwise it wouldn't have been possible. So it was Ashwita's luggage allowance, my luggage allowance, my mother's luggage allowance, all working together for the greater good of getting that massive shipment back home. So all of those in my last two videos. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, I haven't been online for a while now. I was traveling, I had work, I was traveling again, but in the middle I did get to make two quick videos unboxing a whole bunch of comics that were lying at my sister's place, whom I was visiting. So I got to make some videos at least, and then I was wondering about how I was getting all of those comics back home. So that's what the conversation is about, and the good news is all of them got back home. Edinburgh, Chennai, Norway, fantastic, great to see you. Lars, Raghav, super laugh hard. Yes, Edward, so I got those comics back home. Let me just see if I have everything I need. So just give me a second. My bottle. Is my audio video, is that coming through all right? Can everyone hear me fine? Can everyone see me all right? Camera 1 seems to be working. Let's see, camera 2 seems to be working. I do have a problem though, is that I haven't been able to switch off my autofocus, so that's why there's that little camera thing. It really bothers me, so I want to get rid of it, but now I'm averse to messing with the rig, especially now that I'm live. So I was trying to get that autofocus to switch off so I could get rid of everything anyway. All of this stuff is technical. Technical issues seem to be leaving us alone. Great. Thank you. Everyone is letting me know that it's coming in fine. So good to see everyone. Thank you very much for joining us live, or another one of our For the Love of Comics Sunday live streams. And there's a little bit of a history behind this live stream. When is there not? But there is a little bit of a story behind it, and I'm not really sure how long this video is going to go, because I had one idea and then I had another idea and then I started thinking about something else, and then I started going through my shelves looking for top shelf comics and finding a motley assortment of them over the years. So here is what we're going to do. We are going to talk about Top Shelf Productions, which is a company. It used to be a company. It is, I think, now an imprint, or I'm not quite sure about the technicalities, but it's a part of IDW now. It has been purchased by IDW, but for many years it was an independent publishing company publishing comics. And this is, for me, it's a very important company, but in a very under the radar sort of way. And what I mean by that is, when I think about publishing companies, in comics, you have Marvel and DC, right? That's what everyone starts with, or most people start with or know of. And those are two, like, as companies, they're very known and they're very familiar. And I know Marvel and DC. And now everyone here and everyone watching later is better equipped to talk about Marvel and DC than I am, but I have read a lot of Marvel and DC in my life. And because I am of an elderly persuasion, I have read over the years, many different points of time, I have dipped my toes into Marvel and DC. And these days, I don't read that much Marvel and DC, but I do continue to once again, dip my toes into things that people review well and people encourage me to read, and people who know my tastes and reading habits ask me to read. After Marvel and DC, when thinking about comics publishing companies, at one point of time in my life, I learned about Fantagraphics and Drawn and Quarterly as far as North American publishing companies were concerned. Later, I learned about Humanoids and a couple of European companies, but I read in English. So when I look at publishing houses, I'm looking at houses that put out work in English. So Fantagraphics and Drawn and Quarterly quickly rose when I was discovering comics. They rose to prominence as different. Now, there was also, of course, Dark Horse and Image. And in past videos and live streams, I've talked about Dark Horse Comics, Image Comics, and they represented, again, over the years, a certain kind of publishing. It wasn't Marvel and DC, although it had some similarities, but they also had weird identities coming out of what they published. So I would say there's Marvel and DC, there's Dark Horse and Image for my discovery of comics at an adult stage. At a younger stage, I had read a lot of Disney comics. I had read a lot of Harvey comics, Casper, Wendy, Asterix and Tintin, obviously. Again, comics that I've made videos on. So it wasn't just Marvel and DC, and there were also Indian comics that I will one day talk about at length. Childhood reads of mine included a lot of local comics publications that were popular at the time. But as an adult, Marvel, DC, Dark Horse, Image, Fantagraphics, Drawn and Quarterly is the way I was looking at stuff. And then I discovered Top Shelf, and I didn't really discover them as a publisher. I found out one day I happened to discover it was, that there's a lot of this one imprint or this one logo, the little olive on the spine of the books. I was like, oh, I mean, I'd obviously registered the name Top Shelf, but I hadn't realized how many books on my shelves had ended up becoming or were Top Shelf comics, which is different from Fantagraphics. When I discovered the first couple of Fantagraphics books that I read or series, I went online and looked for what else Fantagraphics had published, and it was the same with Drawn and Quarterly. But I never went out and looked for what Top Shelf had published at the beginning. So it was an interesting kind of discovery where I was picking up comics that were catching my eye, that people were recommending, that I read about online, and it just ended up being something that I was like, oh, I guess this is a publisher that's putting out interesting things. But this was over quite a substantial period of time. So it wasn't like a flood of comics that I had at one point. And these ended up including some of my favorite comics of all time. Definitely some of my favorite creators. So First Second had published Alan Moore and Kevin O'Neill and Eddie Campbell. They had published Jeff Lemire, Matt Kindt, Jeffery Brown, Lilli Carre. These were people whose works I really enjoyed and sought out other things. So instead of seeking by publisher, I was usually, I think like most people, I was seeking things out by creator. When I would read something by Dan Clowes, I'd look for more Dan Clowes. If I read something by Chris Ware, I'd look for more Chris Ware. Now, if someone was published by the same publisher or mainly by one publisher, like with Hernandez Brothers and Fantagraphics, you end up with a lot of Fantagraphics books because you're going after a lot of Jaime or Gilbert Hernandez books. So it wasn't, sorry, what I meant to say is that because I was looking for another book by Matt Kindt, or because I was looking for another book by Jeffery Brown, I would find that, oh, it looks like there are some people that are published by Top Shelf, as in more than one book, and that includes people like Nate Powell, whose every comic that I sought out was published by Top Shelf. So Top Shelf's identity for me was created out of the creators, who they are publishing, and how many of my favorite creators or people who are quickly rising in my favorite creators, how many of them are coming out from this one, from this publisher. Hi, Rivanji. No, you're not late. So there's some conversation over here about what were our, first and it all depends on what we mean by the mainstream. I think for a lot of people, Marvel, DC, superhero comics would be the mainstream. But equally, I know a lot of people for whom the mainstream was funny animal comics or Disney comics or even the kind of Indian comics I was talking about, and Marvel and DC blew their mind about like, oh my goodness, what is all this? And this is, of course, back in the days before the cinematic universes existed to have sort of infiltrated everyone's consciousness about it. So if you were reading folk tales and if you were reading mythological stories, then suddenly discovering superhero comics, that would be the different comics. That would be the off mainstream or offbeat, as far as your individual awareness was concerned. So it could be so many things. I really like this idea of what did we think of as comics and what else did we find, because I think of my childhood reading, which I will one day talk about in like detail. I always want to really get into those childhood comics, but because of my childhood reading being so many different kind of comics, including meant for children but non-fiction, I think a lot of those barriers that some people have didn't exist for me, because since childhood, comics were a whole bunch of different things. You had Spider-Man and you had Tintin and you had folk tales and you had mythological stories, and then you had stories of real people and biographies and freedom fighters and things like that. So what becomes interesting is what else can comics do, or in what way are some comics, why is this biography a good biography and that biography a boring one? Those kind of things start coming up about what about the vocabulary of comics makes something interesting. But anyway, getting back to how I found Top Shelf, it's because of those spines, because of seeing over and over again that, oh, that's another Top Shelf book. But it was stretched out over a long period of time. Now, flash forward to last year, almost a year ago, almost to the month, I received a mail and communication with someone at Top Shelf, which was very exciting. And they'd seen my videos on Pat Grant's Blue and the Grot. And then I had made other videos which I called the Australian Invasion, and I have a playlist of those specific videos in which I talked about comics by Campbell, Whyte, Chris Gooch, after I'd made that Pat Grant video. And all of these Australian comics artists were published in the United States, were published by Top Shelf, and they were all Top Shelf books. And they got in touch with me and they sent me a box of comics. They sent me 6 books, and I received that about a year ago. And I never made a video on them. And that's why no one will ever send me books ever again. But better late than never, as I always say. There's been a lot going on in the last year, and some of you will know because of my channel updates and things like that. But I finally got around to reading all of the different books that they had sent me. And then I wanted to talk about that. I want to talk about it as a mail time video of these 6 books from Top Shelf. But I didn't want it to appear as if I've just found out about them, but I did want to say that this package, I'm very appreciative of it, because it is a little eye-opening, because I realized when I was looking, I was like, I know Top Shelf, I'm familiar with Top Shelf, I've read a lot of Top Shelf comics. It ended somewhere as far as their publication, looking at their publication history. And it seems like I haven't read the most recent books until I started reading The Grot and then those other books. Blue was from a little before. So all of this to say, in this video, in this live stream, what I would like to do is I'd like to talk about a bunch of different comics really, really quickly, really fast. So I'll just show them and talk a little bit about them. But the point is to say, how did I read top shelf comics? Which comics over the years were top shelf? What did I think of them? And in many cases, I would have already talked about them, in which case I'm not going to spend that much time. I'll tell you which video of mine you can hear about that book in detail. But sort of a personal history with this publisher and a chronological presentation of the books of theirs that I've read. So once I do that, then I'll talk about the 6 books that they sent me. So sort of a 2-part video. One, a retrospective of top shelf comics that have made an impression on me and, you know, really been part of my evolution as a comics reader, and maybe get into the why and how. And then a brief discussion on the 6 comics that were sent to me. So that's the plan. How far how far we get, we'll see about that. Let's see, anything in the comments? Shudip Das Gupta says 1 year isn't too long. Yes, by my standards, it's not too long, but I do feel bad because, you know, I did get these comics. And the problem is also, among other things, I moved, and then comics and boxes and books were in different places. So there's all that as well. Where is my... Okay. Well, yes, I'm glad to know that there are people who get things and then wait for a long time before they review them. Now, this is not going to be a review. Neither of these sections are going to be a review. What I'm going to be doing is taking a very personal approach. And what I'd love to see in the comments and amongst you in discussion is also personal stuff, because I really like that. I like exchanging stories of how we encountered stories and how, you know, what we got out of them. And that's why you can disagree with someone and still respect that, because it affected you a particular way. It didn't affect me that way. And that's, you know, that makes complete sense. It's the story behind how it affected you. I think that's really the interesting thing. But enough of all of that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the earliest top shelf book that I can think of having read. And the history of top shelf is very interesting if you want to get into it and take a look. But I will say one thing, just because I'm going to talk about 30 comics before I get to the 6 comics that I was sent. I think if you look at the thumbnail of this or the images that I've shared before, you can see which 6 comics they are. But I'm going to start all the way back in history. But even with talking about 30 comics, I think Top Shelf has over 200 comics books that they have published. So this is by no means me saying these are the best. These are just the ones that I've read. And in some cases, I just picked them up on a whim. I was in a bookstore, or I was browsing online, or something was available used, and it was part of a set of 2 or 3 other books I was buying. There are many reasons why I have the books on my shelf. I keep them when I like them. So I'm not saying these are the best comics that Top Shelf has ever published. I'm not saying these are the most significant ones. I'm not even saying that they're historically significant ones for comics or for the company, but they are historically significant for me because these are the ones that I've read and these are the ones that I can opine on. So very early in Top Shelf's history, they published a number of comics, and it's also interesting to read about how the 2 co-founders came together. Chris Staros, I think one of the co-founders, represented Eddie Campbell. And it'll be no coincidence to see a number of Eddie Campbell comics on Top Shelf's list. So the first book that I can think of that I remember seeing as Top Shelf was From Hell by Alan Moore and Eddie Campbell. And this is the thing I'm talking about. This is the thing that I recognized, although they do have a different logo as well and a different insignia, but this olive thing, this is probably the very first Top Shelf comic I remember reading. Now, From Hell is not a Top Shelf comic in the way that many others will be, as in it wasn't originally published by Top Shelf. It was serialized. It was serialized in the UK in a couple of different ways. And then in the US, I think it was serialized by Kitchen Sink Press, or there were a couple of different publishers, similar to Black Hole, although Black Hole was Kitchen Sink Press going out and Fantagraphics taking it over. But I think the 10 issues that make up From Hell were published by various other companies, but Top Shelf in the United States published the collection. Am I blowing this out? Wow. Let me know if this image is not clear to you. I have a lot to learn about exposure. But this book, I think I read in maybe 1994. No. What am I saying? 1998. I think 1998 or 1999. It was published in this collected form in 1991. So obviously it was a big deal book. I wasn't reading comics at that time, and I certainly wasn't reading, the grown-up, dense comic that From Hell is. So 1999 is probably when I read it, and this is one of those proto reads. This is not, I would say that I started reading comics back in full force from, say, 2005 or 2006. Before that, I would read comics every now and then, and I would say that was pretty good because someone would give me some comics because I'd read comics and I talked about Marvel and DC stuff before the movies. But they would give me comics to read and say, have you read this? And I would read something and I would say, that was really good and that was fantastic, but that doesn't mean I'm going to go out and read another comic. This comic was good. And then I'd go back to reading prose or whatever else I was interested in reading. And then maybe I would read another one. And From Hell was one of those. And so was Safe Area Gorajda or Palestine by Joe Sacco. And it's that kind of thing that was like a bridge between me not reading comics and me reading comics a lot. So From Hell is probably my favorite Alan Moore comic. I'll work on a top 10 Alan Moore comics thing, and I'm sorry about those lines as I was explaining before. It's because of the autofocus, but this is a fantastic comic. This is mind-blowing. It is dense. It is intellectual in all the right ways, but it is also thrilling. It isn't, depending on what you're expecting, it isn't a Jack the Ripper murder mystery. It's quite ambitious, and the density of this comic, I think, takes it'll take a long time to talk about it, but very early on, before I was reading comics, From Hell was also one of those comics that sort of transformed my idea of what I thought about comics. Everyone, I think, will have that unless they never stop reading comics and they've just been reading comics continuously. There's a thing that you have an idea, and then that idea is not just changed but sort of blown out of the water. And there were several comics that did that for me, and From Hell was one of those. So back in 99, reprinting reprinting issues that were published elsewhere, but putting it together in this format, which arguably is the format that is the most popular. It wasn't that popular in single issues, or even if it was, that's not rare. And we know a number of comics, we've talked about them, like Day Tripper, etc., that it wasn't in the single issues, it was in the bound volume that they found their audience. And I think it can be pretty easily said that it is in that collected format with the footnotes, with the extras, which were also part of the singles, bound together, that made this what it was. Top Shelf have also published the From Hell Companion, which for fans of From Hell is a terrific book to have as a side annotation, even more annotations about the creation of the book. And most recently they released a colored edition, a colored version redone by Eddie Campbell himself, called the Master Edition. Sleepy Reader, hi, good to see you. Hi, good to see everyone. I've just been talking. Sleepy Reader says that I feel I made a mistake by buying the colored edition. And that's interesting. I mean, if that's the first time you're reading it, I do have friends who the first time they've read it, it has been in that color edition, and they like it. So I think it depends. I find it, when I first heard about the color edition, I thought it was sacrilege. I thought that there's no reason for it to be in color. It was only because it was Eddie Campbell that I was like, okay, it's Eddie Campbell. He's a genius, so he knows what he's doing. Was my approach. I have looked at the color edition. It is interesting. I think it has a different way of doing storytelling. I don't feel convinced that it's the definitive edition. The black and white edition is just something else altogether. That's my opinion. But I do know people who find the color edition fantastic, and I will say that it's not garish. It's muted, but I don't think blood always has to be red on paper to have its effect. And I think there's a certain squeamishness and a certain grit in the black and white version that's a little too clean in the color edition, in my very simple kind of thing. But the black and white is significant. And yes, if this back in 99, it blew my mind about what you could do with comic storytelling and how ambitious it could be. Just the way that I think a lot of people felt about Alan Moore's Swamp Thing or Watchmen. I think any one of those being something you encounter early on when you've only read other kinds of comics would have the same effect. For me, it was from hell. Although I will say that I had also read Watchmen by then. I think Watchmen is great. I just think From Hell is stupendous. So that was 99 for me, for something that was published in 1991. The next big book, and again, this is where I say that I don't know about history as much, but I think the significant work for top shelf comics was Goodbye Chunky Rice by Craig Thompson. Although this is not a top shelf edition, when I was convinced that it was. So when I picked it out of the shelves, my wife Ashwita pointed out that this is actually a Pantheon edition. So this is the UK So this is the UK or the international edition. I guess top shelf wasn't distributing outside the United States at the time, but as an edition, I believe it's exactly the same, flaps and all. I believe the design is the same. But Goodbye Chunky Rice was published in 1999. I think I didn't read it then. I read it after I read Blankets. So Blankets was my first book by Craig Thompson, and in looking for what else Craig Thompson had done, I found that he'd only done one book, or only one book was available at the time, and it was Goodbye Chunky Rice. And I'm not sure how many people are familiar with this. This is Blankets, which is right here. Blankets is probably the most famous, or Habibi after that, and Craig Thompson. This, by the way, is also from Top Shelf, and we'll get to that in just a second. But Goodbye Chunky Rice is not something that a lot of people talk about, or at least I haven't heard them talk about, and it might be seen as a compared to the ambition and the girth of the books that Craig Thompson worked on, it might appear just because it is slim and it is a story with anthropomorphic animals and an extremely cartoony style. It might seem to be slight for children, and particularly because if you know that Craig Thompson, the writer-artist, has also worked on children's comics and series afterwards. Or does today as well. But this is quite, I wouldn't say it's a children's story at all. And I think this got a lot of critical attention, and it got a lot of awards or award nominations, and announced not just Craig Thompson as an interesting person to look out for, a person with, interesting, not just interesting, but fantastic storytelling skills. Depending on what you want in a story, you might have differing reactions to it, but there's no doubt that this person is very much in control of what they're trying to do. I mean, wait till you see what comes up next. But from what I've read and from what I know, Goodbye Chunky Rice is the big book in, ironic for something that's this small, is you had a lot of zines, you had a lot of collections that Top Shelf had put out. They had put out some other comics, and I don't mean to disparage anyone who was published before this. It's just my knowledge is limited. But Goodbye Chunky Rice, I think, is where not only Craig Thompson, but also Top Shelf was noticed as a publisher putting out original work, unlike From Hell, which is a collection and a trade collection, putting out original work, publishing original work that was interesting and fresh and new and experimental or adult, and doing interesting things with comics. Yummy for an 8-ball change Super Love Hard's life. Yes, I often imagine about being, in certain places at certain points of time when certain things were published and being there, because a lot of the time I've caught up later. I've learned about something's reputation online and gotten the collected edition or the hardcover or, whatever was put together for the 10th anniversary, things like that. Very often it's things like 8-ball and Yummy for Underwater, things that I've kind of gone after to get those single issues and to have a little bit of that experience of, imagine these comics being in a comic book store. Imagine looking at these things and then picking up these things next to it, trying to put myself in those shoes. But yes, so that's Goodbye Chunky Rice from 1999, which I read afterwards. And I would say, I'm looking through this list of books over here, and I couldn't find my copies, again, because of all the moving and rearrangement we've done. We couldn't find my copies of Pistol Whip by Jason Hall and Matt Kindt. And those are also crime stories done in a very loose, sketchy, cartoony style that are terrific. And Two Sisters, which was sort of a prequel to Super Spy that Matt Kindt would work on. These were also published by Top Shelf in the period of time between Goodbye Chunky Rice and Blankets. But I can't find those early Matt Kindt books right here. So we're going to move straight on to Blankets, which if I think, again, from what I understand, if Goodbye Chunky Rice was announcing something, Blankets was confirming it. This was a widely hailed book. This was 600 plus pages autobiography done in this gorgeous art style where the level of detail and, as I was seeing in the comments, the stylization were just equally balanced. And also was this heartfelt coming of age story of religious parents and church camp and first love. It was widely hailed. It won a whole bunch of awards. It became a bestseller. This is one of those things that people will often talk about as one of the greatest comics of all time, one of the best comics of all time, and it's got quite a reputation. Like with anything, and I keep saying this just because I don't know why, but just like with anything, it may not be to everyone's tastes. People may not be interested in autobiography. People may not be interested in teen romance or teen love, first love. But I think if you give it a shot, you'll find quite a sensitive portrayal, and especially with that balance between family and religious conservatism and faith and the loss of that faith and that heartbreak of the first love and those things being married together. I think this does a terrific job of telling that autobiographical story. Blankets is a phenomenal achievement and has been widely hailed as such, and I think is definitely one of those books that continued to cement the reputation of Top Shelf Comics. This one is a Top Shelf edition. This Chunky Rice was not. Okay. Comic Crack, good to see you. How is everyone doing? Super Laugh Hard says, have you read any of Alan Grant's work? I think I've read some of his. So it was, I may be misremembering, but The Nail by Alan Grant, because I seem to remember being very impressed by The Nail when I read it. I thought it was one of the best superhero comics I'd read. I mean, granted, it was a long time ago and I haven't revisited it, but I may be misremembering. Okay, moving on. Earl Grey's here. Great to see you, Earl Grey. So that was From Hell, Goodbye Chunky Rice, Blankets. Another book that when looking through the list of top shelf comics that I found was Same Difference by Derek Kim. And I have Same Difference. I really enjoyed it. But then again, I realized this is an edition from First Second with this transparent mylar cover. But this comic was originally published by Top Shelf Comics, and I suppose that the new edition is from First Second. And with this comic, I was looking at certain creators. I had just gotten introduced to Jean Luen Yang, and I was looking at collaborations, and then I saw Derek Kim's comics in an anthology, and I was looking for any comics by him. And this was a beautiful comic, but it was very gentle. It's very low stakes in some ways, but at the same time, it felt very true and very well observed about life. There were a number of books by Asian American comics artists that I was reading at that time, and they dealt with questions of identity and questions of assimilation, family versus the world that they live in, school. And I think there's such a terrific representation of those in these comics in a way that I haven't, at the time that these comics were coming out by these creators, I don't think there was anything in television or film that compared to that. So I need to go back to this. I remember being quite fond of this, but it has been, would I say it's been a decade? I think it's been a decade since I read this, but great stuff, whether you get it in the original or whether you get the new edition from First Second, Same Difference. Okay, but in 2003, Top Shelf published this small book that, once again, is one of those that I haven't really heard people... oh, where did it go? All my organization in vain. There we go. This is The Barefoot Serpent by Scott Morse. And Scott Morse is someone who I encountered just one or two comics of, but has apparently been working in comics for a long time and has done a number of different things. I've only read this book. There's another book called Noble Boy, which is also, it's kind of like a hard card book, as if it's for children. And there is one of those collaborations with Steve Niles in the Dark Horse Books of Terror series, where Richard Sala has Dracula and Scott Morse has Frankenstein. But this is a black and white and, well, no. Yes, it's a black and white and color comic that actually flashes between two different areas. One is a little girl on the beach, and the other is the life of Akira Kurosawa. Just because, but it's very slim, it's very thin, it's done in this this sort of signature style. I realize now that I've looked at other Scott Morse style, in which the parallels between Kurosawa and this little girl, I don't really want to spoil it, because as you can see, it's not very thick. But The Barefoot Serpent by Scott Morse was a surprising read, and this is one of those things that I just picked up on a whim and realized many years later that it was top shelf, but it did strike me as something so unusual and so different from what I've seen. As in, why would you make a comic about these themes? Why would you have it be so slight almost in its presentation? And what are you hoping to achieve? And because you end it with a particular kind of feeling, I mean, I would have liked it to be a little longer perhaps, but it was almost like a little poem, and that's all there is to it. Kind of, here and then gone sort of story that I thought was really interesting. So that is The Barefoot Serpent, written and drawn by Scott Morse. About the Seven Samurai or any of the references, I really think you have to read it, because it's almost as if they're telling the story in snatches and then you go in and out. And why that's happening, I think, is the real interesting thing of why are we given this story in this particular format. Hello, Omar. Welcome to the stream. I really need to read more Scott Morse. Rawanji says that he's great, and I believe it. I think all three of the books that I have read of his are slim works, but his art style is just so interesting, and he really knows how to combine it with text for the effect that he wants to create. At least as far as The Barefoot Serpent is concerned. And then in 2003, they also published Unlikely, and I'm going to talk a little bit about all of these books together because I'm not going to take forever on everything. But Clumsy, Unlikely, or How I Lost My Virginity, and AEIOU and Easy Intimacy are all comics by Jeffery Brown. Jeffery Brown is someone I encountered, I think, in the pages of Best American Comics or that McSweeney's. It's always one of those two, or maybe both. And there was an excerpt from one of his comics, and I really liked his style. It was very sketchy, and it looked kind of amateurish at first, but then you realize that actually it's very effective. My wife was flipping through one of these comics when I was sitting up earlier, and she was like, these are super easy to read. And I think that's really good. That's a sign of good comic skill, of where you can just go from panel to panel and follow along the story, following the moment, the conversation. All of these are autobiographies. So if your patience for autobiographical comics is not that great, perhaps they won't be for you. You could maybe, I guess, make a case for calling them part of that large black and white navel gazing indie autobiography sort of explosion. But the thing about Jeffery Brown is, and he's got a number of books. There's actually another book here by him, Undeleted Scenes, and that is also published by Top Shelf. Focus. There we go. Undeleted Scenes, also published by Top Shelf. But I picked out a number of Jeffery Brown books, and I realized a couple of them aren't Top Shelf books. But I did think of Jeffery Brown as being one of those people who's a top shelf author. Yeah, of course, even though I have a number of his books that aren't. And he's got lots of these. I mean, he writes for children. He's got a number of Star Wars, Darth Vader, Luke, Darth Vader and Leia, those kind of children's books, Jedi Academy. I guess he's won an Eisner for that. He's got the Incredible Change Bots. But his autobiographical stuff, I mean, this is a lot of autobiography, and there's more. His autobiographical stuff, I don't get tired of it. He is very likable as a character, in spite of his insecurities, in spite of his tics, and in spite, the things he goes through. He looks at them with a good mixture of analysis and criticism and sympathy for himself as well. And some of these things are very, very cringeworthy, as you might expect, but I've not really been disappointed. They seem to be honest, and they seem to be open and open-hearted in a way that I really appreciate. So if that sort of withering look at your own life But it's not dark. I mean, it can have dark moments, but I think they all have optimism in them, which is important for some people, especially. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, I would definitely recommend checking out Jeffery Brown, who's always been one of those people where I'm like, I can understand everything you're talking about, even if I haven't experienced it myself, because you're making that, painfulness and that awkwardness, the kind of stuff that he talks about, childhood and teen years. And if you follow all his autobiography, you'll get to the point where he's a father and he's raising his son. And it's actually quite wonderful over the years to see the evolution of this person and the way that he tells stories about his life. But yeah, so that's a whole bunch of Jeffery Brown, starting with Unlikely in 2003. And I see that I've got Clumsy came out in 2004 and AEIOU came out in 2005. So he was just putting a book a year out at this point of time. I think they may have been collected from shorter pieces that he was doing in a zine or something like that. I'm not sure. Also in 2004, alongside Clumsy was, I think, the first publication of Owly. Now, I've talked about Owly in my best comics for kids video. This is one of my absolute favorite comics with no irony and not, for kids. I mean, yes, it's great for kids, but this is a silent, here you've got a page, a one panel a page, but that doesn't, it's a silent, as in mainly textless, 99% textless comic that is about friendship and loneliness and helping each other and warm and fuzzy things, but done with not just great amounts of charm, but with what I think is a significant mastery of the comics medium. Without text, the kind of panel work, the shift, it's absolutely clear for even the youngest of readers to kind of know what's going on. You can teach someone how to read comics by reading Owly, and you're not teaching them basic stuff. You're teaching them quite sophisticated things and the way the panels move. So alongside the story and the gorgeous art, it's also the vocabulary of comics for people, for kids, before language, but also if you want to read it aloud to your kids. There are, I think, 6 books in the Owly series, and they are originally in black and white from Top Shelf, but they may be, I think, available in newly colored editions. So, of course, I like the black and white. I've seen some of the colored, and I completely understand why, because I think people aren't realizing how great these comics are, or not enough kids are being given these as presents because they're not in color. So they are in color now, and they're also Owly illustrated books, etc. But this original black and white thing is, as I said, in no irony, some of my favorite comics ever. Right, so that's Owly in 2004. Then we already talked about what else. So now in 2006 was published. So we talked about Chunky Rice and Blankets and some of these, the ones that I have. I don't know if they were significant for the company, but a book that was very significant for Top Shelf and I think created a fair amount of distress for them was Lost Girls by Alan Moore and Melinda Gaby. This is the 3 separate volume set. I think there's all 3 in one big volume set, which might be the more common way to get it these days. But I'm not sure. I think this still hasn't been published in the UK. I think Wikipedia Online, I think I read that Peter Pan is not out of copyright in the UK. It's owned by a museum or a bookstore or something like that, so they can't release this because this obviously is Alan Moore and Melinda Gaby's take on some very famous characters from literature. Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, Alice from Alice in Wonderland, and Wendy from Peter Parker. And the reason why this was such a big controversial thing, if you're not familiar, is this was openly declared by Alan Moore, the writer, to be pornography. And this is his and the artist's take on, can pornography be literature or something like that. So I'm not going to open these books because they are, well, you know what? I think even the front covers or back covers of these volumes may be explicit. So I'm not doing that. But Lost Girls, in my opinion, is a good comic. It is, whether it's pornography or not, irrespective of what Mr. Moore says, is a different question. It's gorgeous. It's beautifully made. It's very cleverly written. It's obviously got a lot of brains behind it. Whether it appeals to you as a story or not really depends on what you mean by a story. For me, and I did not read Lost Girls in what year did I say it came out? In 2006. I did not read Lost Girls in 2006. It was probably 2009 or 2010, if not later, that I got myself, and I think I became aware of its reputation or what it was at a certain point of time because I was reading Alan Moore and I was finding out. And I was like, yeah, okay, that one's not for me. So maybe after I had gotten through a whole bunch of other Alan Moore, I was like, okay, let me give that a shot and see. I mean, how bad can it be? So I was a little like, that is not my cup of tea, or that is not meant for me, even if it is all literary references, etc. I thought, my mind was changed after I read it. I thought the writer and the artist did a significantly good job in what they wanted to do, in what they wanted to talk about, and they presented it in a way that is wholly unique. So depending on your tastes and depending on your tolerance for this kind of stuff, I don't want to say this kind of stuff because, as I said, I don't think there's anything else quite like it. What you think of it, you should make up your mind, I think, by reading it. I don't think it's banned or illegal or anything like that. It might be something that gets stolen from libraries or may not be in all libraries, but it's definitely worth a look, I would say, if you've never read it. Gore Vidal says, Lost Girls if Alan Moore had written Gotham City Sirens, starring Poison Ivy, Catwoman, Harley Quinn. Yeah, drawn by Milo Manara. See, I think Milo Manara it looks like it's supposed to be erotic. I don't know if the art is meant to be erotic. I think the art just looks like great art, but it's so abstracted almost at times, and other times not. It's a completely different kind of experience, but there are obviously questions of how old are these fictional characters that you're talking about. But again, if the briefest of things I can say about Lost Girls is it's a Canterbury Tales kind of thing where people gather and tell stories, and the frame story is them all gathering these women from these stories, and they talk about their first sexual experience or their sexual awakening. And so all of those stories, the Peter Pan, the Wizard of Oz, the Alice in Wonderland, those stories are reimagined as stories of sexual awakening for these heroes. So how and why, I think, again, is something that one must examine for themselves and take a look. I'm a fan of Lost Girls. I think it is a significant achievement, and I think it's a pretty good comic. Yes, Ananda says this is a family-friendly channel. It definitely is. Did I say Peter Parker? Oh dear. Okay, it can be purchased in the UK legally. All right, good to know. So that whatever I read online was outdated. No, I think that's right, because I think the Peter Pan copyright expired in 2007 or 2008, something like that. So yeah, so until that point of time it couldn't, and maybe that's what happened. It's out of copyright now. As is Winnie the Pooh, and that stuff has already started down its Lost Girls path, I think. Anyway, moving on from Lost Girls, also in 2006 was published. Where is this now? What was the point of me taking all the time to organize everything if I can't find anything? I did find a James Kochalka comic, which was also published by Top Shelf, and I think even early on in their history, they were publishing it. But this is the other logo of Top Shelf. There's that olive that we see, and then there's this one. So most of the times on the spines we'll see the olive, but every now and then if it's thick enough, it might be a time thing. I don't know. But yeah, so apparently not just Magic Boy and the Robot Elf, but there are a couple of other Kochalka comics. Kochalka is an indie American comics artist whose comics are interesting. I've never fallen in love with any of them, but I've only read 2 or 3. So maybe I need to give them another shot. But what I was looking for... Well, all right. I'm going to move on and hopefully find that other comic somewhere else. So also... Oh, okay. It must be under here then. Yes. In 2006, the same year as Lost Girls, Tales of Woodsman Pete by Lilli Carre, this tiny little pocket book almost, this beautiful sort of parchment colored paper and blue ink. A very unique, handmade sort of feeling comic. Very interesting, and I got interested in this because, again, of a volume of Best American in which the Paul Bunyan story from this comic. So this comic has a number of short pieces. Most of them are Tales of Woodsman Pete or of Paul Bunyan, and so this Paul Bunyan story was extracted and included, and it was one of the most curious comics that I'd read in a long time. It just gave me this kind of weird feeling, and I didn't know what. It just felt magical, but not like, fairy, beautiful magical, just kind of, but not surreal. There seemed to be, and then I went out and got this book. In fact, I found this book really cheap, and then a friend of mine said that he found this book really cheap in a store in Kolkata. So I found it online and I got it online. And then he said that there was a store which was selling these for 100 rupees each, which is about $3 or something like that. And, or like $1. Anyway, at that time, and they had about 40 copies. And I was like, what are you talking about? How can they be selling this for that cheap? This is a beautiful little comic, and it's very strange. It's very odd, and it has quite a unique effect, and it got me hooked onto Lilli Carre. So this is the first comic by Lilli Carre I ever read, and I've pretty much gotten everything I can get my hands on by her. She's a very unique writer artist, a very distinct voice. I think she's not making that many comics these days. She's film and art in galleries and things like that. But if you haven't, I talked about Lilli Carre's The Lagoon in my top 10 fantasy comics video and the weird beauty of it. This is earlier stuff. It's shorter, maybe odder, and well, also, and everything by her is odd. But her, it's modern fairy tales that feel sort of timeless, but not in a not in a traditional sense. It's hard to describe. But yes, I was extremely happy to find this book once I had read that extract, read the rest of the book, find it to be equally weird and strange. The promise of that Paul Bunyan section was borne out by the rest of the book, and that started me on finding more Lilli Carre and reading stuff by her like The Lagoon and 9 Ways to Disappear and Heads or Tails. And even her adaptation of Hans Christian Andersen's The Fir Tree. It's just a small little children's book with, half a dozen pages, 24 pages, and it's very, very beautiful. Very interesting. She's also the person who did the cover for the Penguin Huckleberry Finn. You know, I think in a couple of our conversations we were talking about those different covers that the Penguin Classics have come out with, and they've gotten Thomas Ott and Jason and Mike Mignola. So she's one of those cover artists as well. Beautiful book if you can get your hands on it. You know, and I love the format. So that's Tales of Woodsman Pete in 2006. In 2007, and in 2007, this is probably the collection, but in 2005, 6, and 7, or 4, 5, 6, 7, Jeff Lemire was publishing Tales from the Farm, Ghost Stories, and The Country Nurse, which put together would be the Essex County trilogy, which isn't Jeff Lemire's first comics, but it's very early. I think maybe he had a lot of smaller independent things and 1 or 2 publications that I've never been able to find. But for all intents and purposes, most people treat this as if it's his debut. It's not, but early comics, and one of my favorites. I don't think that's a controversial thing. I've heard a lot of people say that Essex County is their favorite Jeff Lemire, and that's saying a lot for someone who is as prolific as Lemire has become. And by prolific, I don't mean just the number of things he's done, but the range of stuff he's worked on. He's worked with almost every major publisher out there on licensed properties as well as creator-owned properties. I think of it as starting with Essex County. This was the first Jeff Lemire I read, and if it was published in 2007, it wasn't too long after that. So maybe 2011, you know, by my standards, 4 years after it was published is not a big deal. So I'm rather proud of the catching up I've been doing, or maybe it was a little later, 2013 or something like that. But this was, it's fantastic, heartbreaking, wonderful stuff. These 3 books are also collected together in the complete Essex County, or the collected Essex County volume, which also puts together 2 one-shots. So the one-shots are not necessary, but they're set in the same world and involving the same characters and the families that are interlinked in these stories. So that's one way, that's a great way of reading it and getting those 2 one-shots. But these 3 stories make up a beautiful triptych, and I really would like to one day take a deeper dive into Essex County. Essex County, no matter what other Jeff Lemire I've read, and I think there's one more on this from this remains to me a very haunting, a very quiet, a sad, but you know, the sadness is this undercurrent until it erupts, but without melodrama. But at the same time, it's also poetic. So it's a very difficult balance, I think, and I think most people would not be able to strike it in the way that he wants to have that drama. He wants to have those kind of surging, potent emotions, but he doesn't want to have shouting and screaming. And so that it's usually things are way too muted or way too loud. And if you want to do both of those things, I think it's very difficult to do. And the way that he makes these things echo inside us, these moments and these lives and these connections and these regrets in this one small little rural community just between 6 or 7 characters is fantastic. So Essex Farms, I keep saying, Essex County, volumes 1, 2, and 3 made into the complete Essex County, or the collected Essex County in 2007. Definitely one of my favorite comics, my favorite Jeff Lemire comic, written and drawn by Jeff Lemire, and one of my favorite top shelf comics. All right. Also, in the same year as Essex County, Super Spy was published. 2007 was a good year for my favorites. I think this is the first Matt Kindt book I ever read. And that started, so you can see how top shelf comics have introduced me, probably not in the years, definitely in most cases, not the years they were published, but has introduced me to people for whom it was the first Lilli Carre I read, it was the first Matt Kindt I read, it was the first Jeff Lemire I read. So when I think back, I'm just like, that's really interesting, because I can think of, as I was saying at the top of the live stream, Marvel and DC, Fantagraphics, Dark Horse, Image, I can think of all of this, but here's First Second, plugging away, giving me creators who would go on to become my favorites. And Super Spy is a great example. So the books I couldn't find, the Pistol Whip and the Two Sisters, they preceded Super Spy. And I think Revolver, which was published by Vertigo, also preceded Super Spy, but I'm not sure about that. But Super Spy was the first Matt Kindt I read, and this is a fantastic comic. I know there are some people who don't like Matt Kindt's art, but I love it. I love Matt Kindt's art, and I love his art combined with his writing. It just gets to the mood of what he wants to do in a very unique way. And this is there's a whole bunch of different stories in Super Spy, and I'll probably do a deep dive on it someday. But essentially, it's a series of stories about World War II spies, and there are British spies and German spies and American spies, and there's resistance, and there are hundreds of characters in these different short stories, but all of these short stories are in a non-chronological presentation. So you read through them, and then you hopscotch back and forth in time, and then you have connections. So you had this one story about this woman and her child, and then you'll have another story about this man and him going AWOL from a mission. You'll have this other one about two spies trying to kill each other, and then you'll eventually get connections between them. You'll see a character who showed up there show up, and because you're skipping back and forth in time, you're going to have deaths, and then you're going to have resurrections because of a flashback story. So it's a non-chronological look at spies and the world of spies and the things they have to do and the things that they do. It's excellent World War II stuff. It's excellent spy stuff, with gadgets and betrayals and disguises and things like that. All of it done in this way. But the real genius of this is how the stories connect with each other. How, as you read this, you get a sense of narrative, a non-chronological narrative, which ebbs and flows and breaks your heart and makes you rise up in cheering, and you are never sure whether what you've read is a happy ending or not, because you're never sure if the next story is going to show you what happens next, or if the next story is going to show you something that happened before that invalidates the happy ending of the story that you just read, and you realize, oh, the briefcase had been switched all along. Things like that. I'm not doing it justice, but it's such a mind-bending thing, but not the kind of mind-bending thing where you find yourself weary. This book is pure entertainment, but it is deep and it is nuanced, and it makes you feel bad for characters, it makes you feel sorry for characters, while telling this kind of yarn set in World War II across many years. Super Spy is the book that convinced me that I need to read everything Matt Kindt writes, because it was so entertaining without compromising on skill and craft. I can't recommend it highly enough. Super Spy, also from Top Shelf. My first Lemire, my first Lilli Carre, my first Matt Kindt. Going pretty well. Is there a question? No, there isn't. Yeah, the art is so expressive. I agree. I absolutely agree. All right, so Essex County, Super Spy, Tales of Woodsman Pete. Okay, now we're getting into the, in 2006, we also had Swallow Me Whole by Nate Powell. And I've talked about this on a couple of videos, or at least definitely in my shelf videos. This was the first Nate Powell. So look at this streak. So this was the first Nate Powell I ever read. And I wasn't reading it in 2007. So 5, 6 years later. And then I was like, what else has Nate Powell done? And I found Any Empire, also by Nate Powell, also from Top Shelf. And in the years since these two, there have been a couple of other books by Nate Powell. So my introduction to someone I really admire and whose books I've really enjoyed, but they also seem to be a Top Shelf author. I mean, I'm sure Nate Powell's got other books out there, but I think every book of his that I've encountered has been published by Top Shelf. And Swallow Me Whole is a story of a family dealing with illness and dealing with mental illness. And it's a harrowing read in some ways, but it's also very poetic. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in detail later as well. But the comics about illness, I think there must be at least a dozen that I've read now that stand out as excellent comics. But they can be, they can take their toll on you because of what you're reading, especially if they're good comics. They're conveying something across, and it's always a tough thing of like, do I want to subject myself to that? And I think I used to think that way because I felt that I'm just going to get wrung out and I'm not in the mood for that, or I don't want that. But the best books about illness, I think they say something more. It's not just pornography, it's not just here, look at this and don't turn away. There's a larger thing about understanding or about dealing with stuff. And I think Swallow Me Whole is a complex and nuanced thing. This is a work of fiction. So this is not like many other comics that I've read. This is not a story of autobiography, although it feels so lived in that I wouldn't be surprised if it was based in autobiography, or it might be. I don't remember. But if you have not read any Nate Powell at all, I think starting with Swallow Me Whole would be a great idea. And Any Empire came out in 2011. All right, so this was 2006 and this was 2011. So this is 5 years later, and this is also a terrific comic by Nate Powell. This is about children and militarization of play, of violence, of how children inherit violence and what culture. And it's done through looking at characters in situations rather than being a larger polemic in general. These two, I think it was 2011 when this came out. I guess it was 2011 or 2012 that I first read Swallow Me Whole, because I remember I wanted to find another book by Nate Powell, and this had been recently or more recently published, and I was very happy about that. So Swallow Me Whole and Any Empire stand in my personal reading as as one of those 1-2 punches. And I've talked about it in a couple of other videos also. Sometimes you find an author, writer, artist, and then you want to find more by them, and the next thing you read is also great. It's just fantastic to have two great reads, and if you can get to a hat trick, then that's just the best. So there wasn't a third Nate Powell book that I could find at the time, so I didn't get a hat trick, but I definitely got the 1-2 punch of these two comics that were fantastic. When David Lost His Voice, yes, that's another great comic about illness. Man, top 10 comics about illness would be such an interesting video to make, because first you'd have to choose that, and then you'd have to think about reading all of these comics together in one go if you wanted to revisit them. Yeah, Swallow Me Whole, fantastic. And if you're just joining us now, hi, welcome. I'm halfway through the first part of my video. I don't know what I'm doing. But okay, so Swallow Me Whole, Any Empire, and then later on, I don't think I have them. Oh, yeah. The Supernaturally Tinged Come Again is also by Nate Powell, also from Top Shelf. And this is something that I think came out in 2019. So this is a pretty, well, there might be something else after that. I'll have to check. And then there's a collection, You Don't Say, which I hadn't seen before. And then one day suddenly showed up in my recommendations. So I think this is an older book, but for me, this is my most recent Nate Powell book. So a collection over here and a fiction novel, Come Again, making a total count of 4 Nate Powell books that I know of or have at least from Top Shelf. All right, then we have a number of, oh yes, this looks like a long video. Let's see, maybe I should speed up. I did mention at the beginning that Chris Staros represented Eddie Campbell. So Alec, the Alec collections were published by Top Shelf. Now this is Alec, The Years Have Pants. This is the only way I've read Alec, and this is the only thing I know. So I think there is another volume. I don't know if that other volume is supposed to be after this or before this, since this is all I know. If you do know what the name of that other volume is and where it falls in the chronology of these semi-autobiographical based on his own life stories, please let me know. But if you haven't read Eddie Campbell, or if the only Eddie Campbell you know is From Hell, I really recommend looking into his works, because the man has incredible range, and the storytelling that he does in all these different comics of his that I've read over the years is very different from comic to comic. Alec is, I think, the big series by Eddie Campbell, Bacchus, is something I've never read. And again, there is more Alec out there. This is one of those things where I'm frustratingly dry as far as the next reading along this is concerned. Yes, there was the olive logo on Eddie Campbell, and Eddie Campbell, Alan Moore and Kevin O'Neill's League of Extraordinary Gentlemen Century. So the initial volumes, the first volumes of League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, came out from America's Best Comics. And that was, I think, Volume 1, Volume 2, and The Black Dossier. I think, yes, The Black Dossier was America's Best Comics. Century were 3 books that were released later. I have them somewhere. There were 3 paperback books, and they came out as longer stories, so not single issues, but they came out with a larger gap, and they were self-contained. So it wasn't an issue-by-issue story. You finished it. And Century had 3 stories set in 3 different years as far as the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen story is concerned. Now, this really depends on your tolerance for the series. This is not the place at all to start reading the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. I guess you could. I would say that this stuff makes the most sense once you've read the last part of The Black Dossier. And The Black Dossier is Volume 3, I think. Or maybe this is called Volume 3. I'm not sure about the volume naming things. But anyway, if you want to read the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, start from the first volume. And if you like it, read the second volume. And if you're still with it, maybe I don't know. Can you skip I didn't enjoy The Black Dossier, but you do have the end of it, which kind of explodes the universe outwards and gives you a whole bunch of other things, which this stuff will follow from. So if you don't care about all of that, sure, pick it up. I like this a lot more than I like The Black Dossier, but I can see why people wouldn't like it. I think people did not like the third volume. for me, the third volume was the best one. The first volume was okay, the second volume was not good, the third volume kind of salvaged it for me, but I don't know, maybe at that point of time I was happy enough that it wasn't volume 2. But I did think that it closed off certain parts of the story and it made for this nice epic across the century sort of story that this wanted to do. I thought it did it well, but again, I don't know if this will be for everyone's taste. It is something that I enjoyed on the whole, although I may not have enjoyed every single part of it. I still think it's sort of very ambitious, epic storytelling that, for the most, gets stuff where it wants to be there. What are some of the worst Alan Moore comics? Star Wars, Devil's World. Never read it, and Backups, and the whole issue he wrote for American Flag. Wow, I've not read any of those. Yeah, start at the beginning and go from there as far as League of Extraordinary Gentlemen is concerned, just to see how your tastes handle it. Super Laugh Hard says Skiz by Alan Moore has aged well. Wow, that's another one that I haven't read. All right, then what do we have? Man, I still have so many comics to go through. All right, I'm going to very quickly talk about two comics that I just want more people to read, and that's Far Arden by Kevin Cannon, who is the brother, I think, of Xander Cannon, who worked with Alan Moore on Top 10 and Top 10 49ers. Yeah, the prequel. And Gene Howe also worked on Top 10, worked on Smacks. But Far Arden is written and drawn by Kevin Cannon in a terrific style. Some of this, I think I remember reading a long time ago that some of this, or the early chapters of this, were done in these 24-hour binges. So each chapter was written and drawn in 24 hours. And later on, he decided to take a more sane schedule to it. But this is one of the funniest comics I've read, and it's not easy to be funny over these many pages. I think most people would not be able to do it for even a third of these pages, but the sense of humor in this comic really appealed to me. The art style really appealed to me. This the hero, Army Shanks, is, I guess he's sort of an Indiana Jones. What's going on? He's sort of an Indiana Jones or Tintin or Corto Maltese. He's an adventurer. He's sailing around the place. He's trying to find this place called Far Arden. It's very funny, but it also is extremely poignant and emotional, something that I was not expecting. And I think there's something in this book that makes it worth revisiting over and over again. That is the skill with which the comedy and where the pathos comes from is put together. And I think some people may find it a little off-putting. Maybe it'll be a bit of a whiplash situation, but I think it's superb. And this book really blew me away, really surprised me with the punch that it packed, and I thought it was fantastic. It's one of my favorite reads from those early years, because it was so different from other things I was reading. Everything I was reading was very serious and meaningful and deep, and this kind of silly escapades and puns and things like that, with the eventual power that it ended up happening, was very different, very unique, and I thought was a great book. And I thought this was a terrific standalone work, and the story was over. So I was really surprised to find that there was a sequel, and I didn't know how you could make a sequel out of this book. I thought this book was done, and it was a good story. It was powerful and all that, but it was done. Where did this come from? And this is one of those cases where I was kind of worried because of how good this was. And I did eventually pick up, and you can see that this is an old, used, ex-library copy, stamps and stuff like that. And I did eventually pick up a nice new copy of the sequel, which is, in my opinion, one of the best comic sequels I've ever read. This was hilarious. This was fantastically funny. this might be funnier, and this ended in a way that you're like, you can't continue this. And this continued it in a way like you're like, of course it needed to continue. Now it's all so clear to me. It's very, very rare that something like this happens. So although they were many years apart, because I didn't know this existed, so I never even looked for it. You don't think, you don't look for a sequel to Watchmen, or do you? But I didn't know this existed, so I got this many, many years later. So it's not a 1-2 punch in that way, but it's something like, I keep talking about Better Call Saul because we were re-watching Better Call Saul because of the new season. So it's like that. It's like, this is something that shouldn't have existed and shouldn't have been as good as it is, and it may even be better than this. It's a good place to be. Far Arden and Crater 15. This one is ships. This one is spaceships. They're pirates to space. Very, very good comics. Very funny, but also quite textured, quite deep, and layered in shockingly surprising ways. But yes, it's exactly the way that I think Ed would worried when a sequel comes out, when a story feels complete. And I do think that most of the time you didn't need to have a sequel, but there are some great sequels out there in literature especially. So that's fine if you can do it well. I'm happy to see it done this well. I'm very surprised, but I'm very happy to be wrong about my trepidations. All right, so that's Far Arden, which was 2009, and I guess according to my sheet, Crater 15 came out in 2013, but I probably got to it around 2016 or 17, because as I said, I didn't know it existed. Then in 2010, which I probably read closer, so probably I read this in 2012 or 2013, because this is one of those earlier comics when I'm getting into comics reading, is Moving Pictures by Stuart and Catherine Immonen, the husband and wife team. Now, this is my first Stuart Immonen. This is my first Catherine Immonen. And I have gone back and read other works that both of them have done. And they've actually worked together on Patsy Walker Hellcat, which I did read in single issues. But this was the first. I didn't know that they worked on superhero stuff. I didn't know they worked on the big two. All I knew is that they were the husband and wife team who made this Casablanca noir art in World War II comic that takes place over an interrogation. And through the interrogation, you get the past lives of this woman who is an art dealer and this German soldier who is interviewing her, trying to find out what happened to those paintings that the Germans want to get once they've occupied Paris. So it's a World War II era set, essentially a conversation between this man and a woman, and they have a history. They have, that's where the Casablanca thing. It's a superb book. It is slim, it is tight, it is entertaining, it is crackling. The dialogue between them, the relationship that they have, the things they're saying, the things they're not saying, the things that exist in the past, the flashbacks, excellently done. Immediately made me want to find more work by these creators. In fact, I once thought about making a video on the best husband-wife teams, so the best spouse teams, but I don't have enough yet. I've got a couple. I've got a handful of people, maybe 3 or 4 people, 3 or 4 couples who work together. Yeah, but no doubt Stuart and Catherine Immonen would make it there. Even on the basis of just this one book from Top Shelf. They have Russian Olive. I forgot the name of the book. Russian Olive to Crimson King, which was very... that's not Top Shelf, I think. Or it didn't show up on the internet list I was looking at. But there are a couple of other collaborations of theirs also completely worth checking out. But start with Moving Pictures. It's good stuff as long as you're not expecting everything to have explosions. I think sometimes just having people talk can be a terrific story, and that's one of them. All right, so then it was Any Empire that we've already talked about. 2012 had in it, Blue by Pat Grant. And this is a comic that I've talked about in detail in my 2 terrific comics by Pat Grant videos. So I talked about Blue and right here, The Grot. So I'm not going to go into detail because I did go into detail about both of these comics into great detail about what's brilliant about them. But Blue, a story about immigration and racism, but with aliens. So there's a sci-fi thing to it, but it's a superb and a speculative dystopian future grifter con man story, The Grot. Terrific comics by Pat Grant. I read Blue. I picked up Blue on a whim, as I talk about, and I was like, oh, and these books, I think, for the sake of this video, it's because of Blue that I reached out to Pat Grant when The Grot was coming out, and got to read a digital copy. And because of the video I made on that, I got to make my video on Campbell Whyte's Home Time and Chris Gooch's book. And because of those videos, you know, Top Shelf got in touch with me and sent me comics. So this is where all of this started, is another big milestone. But yes, do check out that video, my video on Pat Grant's Blue and The Grot, 2 terrific comics. 2012 also saw the publication of Underwater Welder by Jeff Lemire. This is, I think, the closest thing to Essex County by Lemire that I've read. It has more speculative nature in it, but only very slightly. It's black and white, and I really enjoyed this. I didn't love this as much as I loved Essex County, but this is also, I think, very similar because of the quietness and the things that are underneath. And I think that's kind of Lemire. I don't want to say, because there's so much that he's done that I've not read, but Lemire seems to be a master at talking about, you know, what's being repressed and what's underneath and what's being stifled. There are a couple of things by him that I've read that I've not enjoyed, but I would say that I enjoyed the Underwater Welder. I should probably read it one more time because I've only read it once, unlike Essex County, which I think I've read 4 or 5 times now. So I probably need to revisit this, but it is, well, compared to a lot of his, obviously his superhero stuff or his science fiction stuff, this is probably the closest to that sort of autobiographical feeling, although obviously this is also speculative and not autobiographical. I do love his science fiction, especially his creator-owned things, but there's just something about, Essex County and the kind of stuff that he's doing in Underwater Welder that that has a particular appeal to me. Moving Pictures is out of stock. Why? Why do they do that? I mean, I hope they reprint it. It's just, it's one of those things that you think that it's a 25-minute read or something like that, but then you'll want to come back to it. You'll want to pick it up and sort of wallow in this little conversation that they had again and again, which is one of the best reasons for wanting to have a book on your shelf. Royal City has more in common with Essex County. Royal City is one of those that I haven't read. I've heard a lot of people talk about it, and a number of people put it on their best comics of last year, or favorite comics, etc. I should get my hands on that. But yeah, that's good to know because I like Essex County. Then we have, WYSIWYG by Ed Piskor also came out in 2012, but I could not find, that's another one of those that is not highlighted because I couldn't find my copy of it. Crater 15, which was the sequel to Far Ardent, we have already talked about. And speaking of the canons, in 2013, and I guess it would have been pretty close that I read it, was Heck by Xander Cannon. Xander Cannon and Gene Ha were the artists for Top 10 that Alan Moore was writing, and Xander Cannon did the art for Smacks, which was the sequel. So Gene Ha did, as I was saying, 49ers. So Heck, I think, was a web comic. This is the format. And it was a web comic that was published online. And I think it was finished in this volume, or it finished online and then was collected in this volume. This is a supernatural, magic tinged monster hunter exploration story that, like like Kevin Cannon's Far Arden, is a funny story. And this one's more of a light-hearted adventure with comedy in it that ends up packing a serious wallop. I don't know if the brothers have conferred on taking this approach to making the reader get their guard down, thinking, oh, I know what kind of story this is, and I know what kind of way, where it's going, and then kind of hit you in the stomach with something. This is maybe not at that level as those other comics as far as the gut punch is concerned, but it still does get it does go somewhere at the end that feels like a brave choice for something that has taken this approach. But I just loved the inky art style. I loved the story, which had a real kind of sense of tension and fun to it. The sense of humor in it is excellent. I think more stuff from Xander Cannon, just like more stuff from Kevin Cannon, please. I want to see them do this stuff where they write and draw, because I get the feeling that they might end up being people who draw for other people's scripts, and I get it, I understand it, and I'm glad that they Xander Cannon collaborated with Alan Moore for those top 10 stories, but I want to see more stuff like Heck. I wouldn't mind seeing, I didn't expect a sequel from I didn't expect Crater 15, the sequel to Far Arden, so I don't think there's a way you can make a sequel for this, but I would like to be proven wrong and see a sequel for Heck come up. Xander Cannon did Replacement God. I don't know Replacement God. He did Kaiju Max, which again is a series that is quite unexpectedly good. So Kaiju Max is Heck is also out of print. What is? Well, maybe this is something to do with Top Shelf. Maybe Top Shelf needs to put certain things back into print. I mean, these, again, as I said at the beginning, I don't know if these are the best things they've ever done or these are the most important comics, but I really enjoyed these comics and they were very important to me. So I don't, I feel bad when people say something is out of print, which happens all the time, because it's one thing to say, oh, that absolute edition and that leather-bound thing, blah, 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 is out of print. You're like, fine, but in it, the paperback being out of print means people can't get to it and can't read it. That's the part that really worries me. Oh, the Cannons are not brothers and they're not related. Thank you very much. That's one thing. I guess I just made that assumption. That's so unfair of me. But I think somewhere this connection between Far Arden and Heck, the way that they have comedy at the forefront and then emotional thing at the back. For some reason, I thought, oh, both the brothers are interested in the same kind of storytelling. So I probably did a little bit of fiction in my head as well. Views on Bump by Joe Sacco. Bump by Joe Sacco, I don't think is top shelf. It's an unusual, it's a collection of earlier stuff. I mean, yeah, it was interesting. But we're talking about top shelf today, and I'm already behind schedule so badly. Sorry, I'm gonna march right on, being apt, because 2013 saw the publication of March. I think 2013 was book 1, and then book 2 and book 3, and then they came out in the slipcase. And I've talked about this a little bit, I think in one of my Eisner's live streams, so Senator John Lewis. But the interesting thing is that March, all of these books, it's written by John Lewis and Andrew Aiden, and it's illustrated, and I can't squeeze them out, but it's illustrated by Nate Powell. So Nate Powell's relationship with Top Shelf continues. And this, I think was a bestseller. This was recommended in schools and in libraries and things like that. So this is another one of those big famous books, I think, that that Top Shelf have put out as far as sales and reputation is concerned, and I think deservedly so. There's something really powerful about these books, because they seem to be so much about principle and so much about the theory of what we're talking about when it comes to democracy and civil rights, and the fact that this isn't just it's people, it's real people, and real people did these things, and real people fought in this way. It's that making of those concepts real, to say that they're not just idealized, notions which have got no place in realities. Like, these are things that people quest for, these are things that people fight for. Pretty powerful stuff, and connected to something else that we'll talk about as well. So that was 2013, March. After that, we have, what's on this list? I'm going to move through this. It's been a long time. Oh, we have more League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. So you have the Nemo books come out, and I couldn't find that box set, but you would have seen it in one of my shelf videos if you've looked, if you watched those. So this is just continuing the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen saga, but through other characters and characters related to Nemo. So we get Nemo and Nemo's daughter and granddaughter, I think. It's been a while. Again, good fun. If you're a fan of the series, your individual mileage may differ, but again, I can't think of those books being good things to pick up first. I mean, I suppose you could, because they are about standalone characters and they are disconnected plot-wise. They don't have much to do with the stuff that's come before. But I still think that you'd want to know who these people are. But maybe the Nemo books, and there are 3 of them, and they're available in a slipcase, so you can buy them separately. The Nemo books might be the one part of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen that you could read by itself, just because they're not directly following on from, except for the first book maybe, but they're not directly following the characters that you've seen before, and it's different people or people you've only seen once or twice. But that's Captain Nemo, not Little Nemo. All right, most of these top shelf titles are out of print. Well, that is unfortunate. I wonder if they've got any plans for reprinting any of these books. But we did see, what I think we can see is that most of these are creator-owned. I mean, they're all creator-owned titles, or that's at least my assumption. And by seeing things like Same Difference coming out from First Second, where it used to be a top shelf book, I think creators will always have the opportunity to take their work to another publisher if another publisher wants it. If Top Shelf doesn't, if any publisher doesn't reprint your work or doesn't keep your work in print and you own the copyright, I think you would have the rights to take it somewhere else. Of course, you'd have to find someone who wants to publish it, but it's not like, I think in all of these cases, they don't own the copyright, the creators do. So hopefully we would see some version of these stories come out someday. Let's see. That is unfortunate though. So Nemo was Heart of Ice, Roses of Berlin, and River of Ghosts 2013, 14, 15. And then the box set of that. All right, so that's what finally. So I've gotten through my little Excel sheet, and that's just a small sampling of what this publisher has published over the years and what I've read and what I've enjoyed. And that's, I think the last book over there was the Nemo stuff from 2015. So it seems to me that that's where it goes off. But I think the list must have been incomplete, because we know that just the way that we saw Blue and the Grot is a more recent book. The Grot is from a couple of years ago. So my video was made when the Grot was published. So Campbell Whyte's Home Time. These are the ones that. So The Grot by Pat Grunt that I just talked about. Home Time by Campbell Whyte, which is in 2 volumes, Home Time Volume 1 and Home Time Volume 2. And I made a video on this comic as well. Significant work of all ages comics, in my opinion. I thought this was a stupendous work. Really marvelous achievement, and something that has the potential to be a classic. But I do have a video on this, so check that video out, in which I take a look at the pages and I talk about what makes it so special. Similarly, check out the Blue and the Grot video that I have, where I talk about what makes that great. And there is Chris Gooch's Under Earth, which I also have a video on, along with Francois Vigneault's Titan. So these are comics you can get a closer look at in those videos. I do have a couple of other Chris Gooch books. Bottled is a I think Bottled is a novel, and there's a collection of short stories called Deep Breaths. But it's such a mess over here. But these also, the Australian Invasion from Top Shelf Comics. All right, so this is what I have so far. All right, now, last year, I was sent 6 books, which, interestingly, Lee, who sent me these, must have a good sense of my taste, because I enjoyed everything I read. And also, interestingly, 2 of the 6 comics that I was sent, I had already purchased for myself. So those 2 comics were They Called Us Enemy by George Takei and others, and The Book Tour by Andi Watson. These 2 books I'd already gotten, but I was happy to get that. In fact, I don't remember. I had the hardcover, and they sent me the paperback expanded edition with new material, or I had the paperback expanded edition and they sent me the hardcover. I don't remember which one, but I just purchased They Called Us Enemy when I got that in the mail. And the other books are The Delicacy by James Albon, KODI by Jared Cullum, Parenthesis by Élodie Durand, and A Radical Shift of Gravity. Now, unfortunately, I haven't finished A Radical Shift of Gravity. And that's unfortunate, because I really wanted to talk about it. And I didn't know where these books were, and I found a couple of them and I didn't find the others, etc. So in preparing for this video, I thought I would read this, and I tried to rush through it. And it's complex, or, well, I wouldn't say complex from the it's difficult to follow. This is a rather meditative science fiction story from what I could make out. The art style is simultaneously lush and simple. Some parts of it look, well, I wouldn't say sketchy, but very modern comics of some artists. You know, you can fill in your artists over there, where just a few simple strokes, very clean sort of face, not a whole lot of lines as far as facial features, etc. are concerned. I've seen Peter Parker maybe drawn this way. There can be a variety of different comparisons you can make, but the story of this, and I don't want to skip too far ahead because I don't want to spoil it for myself. The story of this it revolves around the notion that Earth's gravity is slowly losing its power, and things are beginning to not have the same pull as they did. So people have to start anchoring themselves and things, otherwise they'll float away. And our hero is a new father, and now he's trying to navigate the world that that his child is going to come up in, is going to be brought up in, and what they're going to inherit. And this, from what I could see at the beginning, from what little I've read, maybe that much, first of all, it skips back and forth in time, or it has at least 2 or 3 different timelines. So it's not linear, and it seems to be very gently paced. So it's not like, oh my God, this is happening and there's a crisis all around the earth on what are people going to do. It seems to be a much more grounded approach. So he's a reporter, so he is reporting, or he's a features writer, and he's reporting on things that are happening. So they're almost like human interest stories, some of them, of a different kind of sport because of this weaker gravity. So the story, I think, it really remains for me to see where it goes. So I'm not able to speak on it beyond that basic summary, because that's all I've been able to do. And because of its complexity, not just because of the concept, but because it wants to be patient and because it wants to skip back and forth in time, me trying to rush through it for this video just wasn't a good idea. So I'm going to have to get back to you on that one. But luckily, all of the other books are books that I have been able to finish reading. Let's see. The Delicacy by James Albon. This is my first James Albon. So from the author bio at the back, James Albon has been working in comics for a long time, and I have never read anything by him. But based on this one book, I am ready to read more by him. It's got a beautiful illustration style. It feels sometimes like a children's book, when, you know, especially when it fills up the entire page like this, and the text that you get is written in this way, but you also have your comics panel work like this. The colors are gorgeous, but the entire story has such a unique feel to it, because it's about food, which I love, and it's about cooking. And I think by the time I'm getting to the Delicacy, I can look back on a lot of whoops, a lot of top shelf comics, and say, what is the identity of top shelf? You know, it's like if we were giving Dark Horse a certain identity or Image a certain identity, no one identity would be correct anyway, just because they're so diverse. But you can kind of create this, all right, here's some stuff that has to do with the supernatural, and here's some stuff that has to do with really out there speculative stuff, and a lot of criticism can be, I heard someone say, Image Comics is just like Netflix pitches, which I can completely understand. So, like, what is the identity for Top Shelf Comics? And Top Shelf Comics seems to be their autobiographical. There are lots of autobios that I've seen, and a lot of slice of life, and a lot of coming of age, but with a slight speculative bent. Not something as supernaturally crazy as you might see in a Dark Horse comic, not something as science fictionally, and I'm obviously being very, very general over here from very limited reading. But if I was to create an identity for this publisher based on these books that I'm looking at, there's fact and non-fiction, and then there is realistic fiction, and then there is just one little thing that's not quite realistic, or one little thing that's speculative, but not in a magical realism way, in a way that is part of the texture of that particular narrative. But across various stories up to the Delicacy, I find that to be at least a pattern that I can spot. So the Delicacy is about two brothers who find out that they have inherited a piece of property from their uncle and their aunt, and their mother is a little hippie mother, and this is English. It's an English comic, so they don't live on the mainland. And then the two brothers decide to take that piece of property, and one of them is a farmer and one of them is a chef, and they start a farm to table business. And then it's difficult to talk about it without spoiling it, because it's this thick, and you are going to have 2 or 3 different kinds of stories as you read this, but not like, oh, from here to here it's one type of story, from here it's all blended in. But the story has some very interesting twists and turns. At the same time, it doesn't feel like a noir or a like a suspense crime movie or anything like that. It's got a very gentle flow to it, but it also has this authorial voice that keeps narrating. And usually I don't like that kind of authorial narration in many comics, even if it is coming from when it speaks over a panel that's doing something else. But the authorial text in this book is so classic feeling. It judges the characters, and it says that he started to ignore, and this was no longer. It doesn't feel like a sterile presentation of narration, and something about that made the entire story about cooking and about farming, about ingredients, and about gastronomy, and about the high culture of food criticism and London nightlife. There are so many different things going on in this, and it was an absolute blast to read this story. It can be pretty funny. It is always entertaining, and it twists and turns in a way that isn't sensationalistic. It's just like gentle twists and turns, but you'll be rather surprised about where you end up, both with the plot as well as. So Aninda says that Delicacy read like a modern fable. Yeah, if you've read this, it does feel like a fable, but it feels like one of those fables that doesn't necessarily have a straightforward moral, which I thought was quite interesting. Although you think there is some sort of a morality play going on, I don't know if it can be claimed. But I thought this was a great comic. I think I'm not sure, but I think this is published by Top Shelf originally. I don't think this is a reprint of an existing book, but I could be wrong. Let me know if I've gotten that wrong. All right, so that was the Delicacy. Next up, KODI by Jared Cullum. And it's funny because I got this book, and this might have been the first book that I looked at when I first got the package, but then things got crazy and things went away, and I knew that I had this book, and I knew that I had to get to reading it, but I kind of forgot. But it stuck in my head. And then I was talking, I think, in a previous live stream about Usagi Yojimbo, I was talking about an Usagi Yojimbo depiction that I had really appreciated and liked, but I couldn't remember who it was by. Then I went away, I looked it up, and then I found that it was Usagi Yojimbo done by Jared Cullum, who had just recently done a variant cover for Usagi as well, and it was his sketches that I had really liked and appreciated. And I was like, oh, that's the guy whose book I have, and I haven't gotten to it yet. So I finally did get to read KODI, but it's so ridiculous that I was like, oh, there's an artist whose work I really appreciated, and it's like, yes, and you got his book in the mail a year ago, or almost a year ago, and you haven't read it. So this is written and drawn by Jared Cullum. This is a little fairy tale kind of story. Edward says it looks the cutest. It is definitely the cutest. Check out this motorcycle riding grandma over here. KODI is a variation on a particular kind of theme. I think, what would you call the theme? A boy and his dog sort of theme. The Iron Giant is that way, or Boy and His Robot. The Black Stallion is what I always think of. But the Black Stallion, the Iron Giant, How to Train Your Dragon, they're all sort of the same kind of formula, if you want. And this is that one of this little girl finding this bear, this Kodiak bear in the woods. And it's it's not really realistic and it's not a magical fairy tale. So he doesn't talk. I mean, he's a bear, but it's not necessarily our world in which you have to worry about this girl's safety as far as this bear is concerned. It's very much a children's fairy tale done with these lovely watercolors, and this is a completely heartwarming, heart-tugging story. And I did wonder if it would be a little too young reader for me, but the charm of the characters, the beauty of the art, and the very nice pace and the layouts and the way that the story takes its time to give a couple of different characters center stage, not just this girl and the bear. That really worked for me. And in spite of myself, in spite of my cruel, cool and cynical self, there are moments in this that just make you like sort of cheer, and they create this surge within you in spite of yourself, which I thought was an accomplishment. So very cute, absolutely heartwarming, very, very cuddly, but also emotionally stirring. I mean, it's not it's not a dark fantasy or anything like that. It's an absolute gorgeous little fairy tale, perfect for kids. I bought this for my nephew this trip that I was on just before this, and he also enjoyed it and gave it his stamp of approval. So that's KODI by Jared Cullum. KODI is one of my all-time favorite comics. Great all-age read, Rosen says. Absolutely, absolutely. I think it is, and it's also the kind of stuff that I think you can, though the reason why I love comics on the shelf is so you can return to them, so you can pull them out and you can go through it. And this is one of those books that you can really just go from cover to cover in 15, 20 minutes. But you feel nice being in that world. There's even a part of it which isn't quite Babe Pig in the City, but that whole fish out of water thing of this animal in the city, it's stuff you've seen before, but it's done so charmingly, so well that I agree. I think it's a fantastic comic. Then we have Parenthesis by Élodie Durand. Now, this is a French comic from 2010 or 2012, and this is published in English by Top Shelf. So the copyright is 2010, but it's published by... Oh, now I can't find where the thing is, but 10 years later, let's say it's published in 2020 or 2021. Parenthesis is an English language edition of a comic from 12 years ago. And the comic itself is an autobiography of something that happened 10, 12 years before the comic was published. And what happened is the author had a tumor in her brain that gave her epilepsy. It was tumor related, and after the tumor was removed, the epilepsy got worse. This is one of those books about illness that I was talking about, and I think somewhere in the beginning or in the marketing material or something, it said it had won an award of best book about illness or top 10 books about illness, and it's one of those tough things, and this is an example of those tough things, because this, I think, is a terrific comic. And it is difficult to read, but I also think that it is a terrific comic that everyone should read. And the balance of being hard to read and must reading, that balance is, for everyone, it's a different one to navigate. But the author over here does a fantastic job at trying to get us, the readers, to understand what she went through. And the biggest thing, the manifestation of this epilepsy, apart from the fits and the spells, etc., is memory loss. And a lot of this story is about her not remembering things, is about her not having the memory of something that just happened, a conversation she was involved in, and the inability to communicate, and the more and more closed off and isolated and sleeping to survive. It's very difficult for me to judge the value of someone telling such a personal story. What I can judge is the effectiveness of the tools that they use. And Epileptic by David B. Guido van der Zee, that's one of the first, the obvious kind of, because it is about epilepsy, it's French, is one of the first things I thought about. And this has some similarities, but I also think it's very distinctly a look at epilepsy that I had not encountered before. And I think that's the greatest. It puts me in the author's position of being unable to communicate, of being in blackness, of losing awareness, of losing time. And it makes me feel the terror of that. But briefly, because I'm just a tourist, I'm being given a pass because of the person who's doing the storytelling. And it's a testament to how good the storytelling is that I feel that I get into that. This is it's not a difficult book to read from the point of view of, oh my God, all this suffering, I don't want to read about it. It's a difficult book to read because you have to put yourself into someone's shoes, and what they're talking about is something so alien and so different from what our experience is. And that's, I think, the stories about illness, and that's why this one works, is that she herself feels that she's unable to communicate at certain points of time, and she takes refuge in drawing, or she draws. And the drawings that she does, she says, better communicate what she was feeling. And these are those drawings that she did in that period, 1995, 97, as she was recovering and as she was having these fits and as she was going through this. So there is a lot of historical scrapbooking in the story. A lot of it is interviews with her parents, her talking to her parents and her talking to her mother, and just like, oh, were you there? And like, of course I was there. We were all in the same room together, and this is what you said at that time. And then she creates these incidents in which her friends say, I just offered you chocolate. You said you don't want some, now you want some chocolate. Everything is being filled in for her because she has no memory by other people, and she's transcribing what they say as her story for you, the reader. It's an amazing feat of storytelling. It's an incredible job of editing this experience of these years of experience, some of them in a blur of sleep and darkness and not being able to remember, not being able to communicate, and then coming out of it. The end of it is and there's that thing is, why is it called Parenthesis? Is like she receives a thing of being no longer epileptic, of not having the illness anymore, and she's recovered, but it hangs over her. Like it could, the fact that she had to relearn so many things. She had to relearn vocabulary, and she had to relearn experiences. It's an optimistic end. It's sort of glorious of how someone has pulled through and what they have gone through and the kind of support they've had to bring them there. But it is also, an open parenthesis. It's like, will this return? Can this come back somehow? And what does one do in such situations? I do think this is a very hopeful book, but also hopeful not because it gives this kind of false promise. It's about the toughness, and it's about how tough it is. But that's, I think, where the hope comes from. It's just like, yeah, we are capable of those things. People are capable of those things. It's incredible what you can go through and what you can come out on the other side of. So I found it an extremely moving read. I found it a fantastic autobiography. I found it a fantastic experience and a journey, and I highly recommend Parenthesis. It's an award-winning comic, so I'm not really sure why it took so long to come out in English, but I'm very glad that Top Shelf has brought it out in English. All right, only 2 books left. We're almost there. The finish line is in sight. They Called Us Enemy by George Takei, and I'm going to give you the other people's names as well. So it's written by George Takei, Justin Eisinger, Stephen Scott, and the art is by Harmony Becker. And this may be, of these 6 books, I'm not counting From Hell and Lost Girls and all that stuff. Of these 6 books, this may be the most famous one. This might be the biggest deal, just because it's an Eisner winner for Best Reality. It's a bestseller. This, I think, if we look at it's interesting to say where does what match, So what does KODI match in what we have seen before? I'm trying to remember what in. Maybe there isn't an absolute all ages or young readers work in the list that I talked about. Now that I saw that I'm almost at the finish line, I've decided on a new project to keep the video going for longer. But yeah, I don't see anything that would absolutely match KODI. So maybe that's something that Top Shelf are doing more of now, or maybe I'm just not aware of the earlier stuff that they had done for kids or for young readers, because I can see, yeah, nothing at this level. Fine, that's one thing. Where does, I would say, Parenthesis, dealing with illness, for example, we definitely saw that. We saw Swallow Me Whole, which was not non-fiction, which was an autobiography, but it's got that sort of approach. And there are a couple of other books that I'm forgetting right now. The Delicacy has that slight little bit of speculative fiction and weirdness at the edge of something that could very easily be a realistic story. And They Called Us Enemy, I guess, though, the thing that would match the closest to what we've seen before is the March trilogy, from John Lewis and Nate Powell and Aiden. So it's autobiography. It's autobiography of a famous person. It's autobiography of a famous person who isn't known for comics, but who might be known to comics readers for different reasons. It's an autobiography in American history. And this in particular deals with the internment of Japanese, let's say Japanese origin, Japanese people during World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor. So there are some, I wasn't very aware of this, although I had only a very slight idea. But along the West Coast, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt declared concentration camps for people of Japanese origin, because the thing is that they're citizens. Well, I guess it's immigrants or non-citizens, because George Takei's father was not an American citizen, because you couldn't apply for American citizenship if you were Asian at that time. So you were an American citizen if you were born in the United States, which his mother was. But at the time that this law was put out, their family was uprooted, was dragged out of their home, and just taken out and put into, first they were put into some like stables, like some horse stalls, and then they were moved to a couple of different concentration camps. And this is the story of the 4 years between the age of 5 and the age of 9 that he spent in those American concentration camps with his family, with his siblings and his parents. There's actually an opportunity for his mother to get out of there, but she can't leave her family, and so she renounces her American citizenship, which means that once the war is over, she's in danger of being deported. That stuff comes after the internment. But I got this book, first of all, because I don't know very much about this period of time, and I'm not familiar at all with any of that experience of being in those camps. And I I don't follow George Takei on social media, but I have seen from time to time his activism, and he strikes me as, in my whatever view of things, he strikes me as a very humane person. He strikes me as an activist for human rights and civil rights and democracy. And I wondered about this story. I wondered about, being interned by a government, and now you're famous as an activist for democracy. I wondered about the connections of that. So those were the two reasons why I wanted to pick this book up. What interested me, what amazed me was the style of this book. One is, it's a very plain, easy to read, and you could say it's manga-like. I'm not going to say that Becker, the artist, it's not a Japanese comic. It's an American comic, but it's definitely coming through as in a particular style, which makes it a clear and easy to read. It flows absolutely fine, but there's also this other choice, I think, of where you're seeing something that is part Japanese, part American, which is very much the theme of this, of where do you belong, and what makes a citizen, and what makes someone American, and how do we treat each other as human beings. And the father and the mother are the two characters that I think you will remember the most from this book. The father being sort of this ridiculously unflappable person who, in spite of what's going on and what they're being put through, never stops believing in this government and in the process of democracy, irrespective of the government's laws that would eventually be found to be unconstitutional and reversed. And that's what he wants. He wants that legal battle. He wants it to win in court because he believes it will win in court. And on the other hand, you have the mother who wants to protect her children. And it's not quite the same, but it reminded me a little bit of the movie Life is Beautiful, La Vida Bella, about where she makes it a game. She makes it going camping for her children to protect them, and it kind of works. The kids they're not absolutely exposed to the horrors and the cruelties of things around them because of the kind of protection that the mother gives them. So the dynamic of the father and the mother with the family, I think, is what makes this really worth reading. Of course, there is the historical value, and there's the other thing in the structure of this is it flits back and forth between the past and a narration by the author, and that takes on, and that happens very often. You'll have a narration. The narration in this comic takes on the form of a TEDx talk and lecture and conversation, and that going back and forth creates a good effect for me because the child is innocent and the child doesn't see stuff, and it would have been, I think, wrong to try to give a certain kind of wisdom to some kid, like between the age of 5 and 9. How much did you actually absorb and how much did you actually analyze? So the analysis is taking place by the adult. It's the adult looking back and having had things filled in, and then the child's experience is presented as the child's experience. And I thought that was a really good touch. I thought that was very well crafted, and it made reading this story not an effort, because I am a little worried about narrative trickery and cheating and things like that that people like to do in order to have a dramatic effect. And the fact that this book avoided that with a good structure and with some elegant editing is what makes it worthwhile. So that's They Called Us Enemy, and everything. I like the title, They Called Us Enemy. It's not there's a lot of thought that's gone into this, because the whole thing is about them and us, and who are we to each other, and how much does it take for us to turn on each other? Those kind of things, those kind of cheerful things that we love to explore in literature. All right, and now we have the last book on this, The Book Tour by Andi Watson. Now, Andi Watson, this is not my... So, yeah, continuing with the pattern. This is my first Durand. I have not read anything else. This is my first Albon. This is my first Takei novel, and when I finish this book, this will be my first Tapalanksi and Glasheen. It's written by Mike Tapalanksi and illustrated by Kate Glasheen. A radical shift in gravity. So these are my firsts. Like a lot of top shelf comics have been my firsts. The book tour is not my first Andi Watson, but it has been a long time, many years ago. And now I would go back to like 2011 or 2012, maybe even earlier. I read Paris by Andi Watson, written by Andi Watson, with art by Simon Gain. And I did briefly try to find Paris, but I've talked about it in one of my shelf videos. It's also there in my single issues cabinet video. Paris was a great comic. I think it was 4 issues and then collected into a small book the size of moving pictures. But it was set in 1920s, 1930s Paris. It was about a young girl traveling, a young woman, I should say, traveling to Paris for the first time and finding love with another woman. And it was just done so romantically and so much with a sense of place and mood and time, and the relationship blossomed in such a believable manner that I was like, man, this is, and the art by Simon Gain was fantastic. It looked like Indian viewers will know Mario Miranda. It looked like Mario Miranda, thick lines and nice angles, and it was beautiful. And I was like, ooh, this is good stuff. Let me find more stuff. And I couldn't find anything else by Simon Gain, and I couldn't find anything else by Andi Watson at the time. I did find a series, a comic series called Little Star, which was written and drawn by Andi Watson. And it was this absolutely lovely story of this father and his daughter, and bringing up his daughter, his little girl. And it was just about them. It was just about him being a father to this girl, and the thoughts and the fears that he had, and their little encounters. And it was beautiful. Again, nice, quiet. So I had that romance, and then I had this parental thing, and those are the only 2 Andi Watson comics that I ever read. And now I found out, because of the book tours blurb, that he's been writing for a very long time, and he's got a whole bunch of stuff. But from what I gather, he has been doing a lot of stuff for children. And this, they, I think they say this right at the back, in his first book for adults in many years. So I mean, like, that's as this he's back to writing for grown-ups, or here is a book. And this book was absolutely Vijay Lakshmi says George Takei of Star Trek. Yes, George Takei of Star Trek. Although these days he's probably as famous as being an activist and as an icon for human rights and democracy than for Star Trek, which is a great career path to have. But the book tour by Andi Watson was fantastic. This was a great comic. This is one of the best books I've read in a long time. It's hilarious. It is very well drawn in a what the marketing material calls a retro style, or some reviewers call a retro style. I mean, you can see a little bit of Charles Schulz, maybe, some sort of simple lines and simple expressions conveying a lot of different kinds of tone, but a certain kind of deadpan nature to it as well, which works fantastically for this very dry British, kind of delivery of some increasingly ridiculous things and situations. So the author is on a book tour, and his book tour isn't going very well. But I'm not really sure what time this takes place in. This is definitely before cell phones and all of that stuff. And it's in England. And so he's just traveling into different cities or different towns in England or Britain. But there's not much other than that. And that's what makes it feel like Kafka or Dostoevsky or one of those sort of absurd things in which the city and the systems and the government and the police are all kind of weird and anonymous and at the same time omnipresent. It had this really lovely oppressive feel of a noose tightening, because what you end up with is this kind of not noir because it's not at all noir. It's this kind of dark comedy spiral into absurdity and getting wrapped up in things beyond his understanding. But unlike a lot of noir mysteries, this guy, the author at the center of this, remains more or less unflappable. Not unflappable. He's definitely in an absurd situation, and things are getting worse for him. But I don't know. There's something about how British he is, and about how he doesn't want to bother anyone, and how he doesn't want to say anything about anything, that makes it just it's hilarious, and it's also extremely cringy because he's in situations where no one shows up, and the kind of ways that the bookstore owners talk to him, and you're like, oh, do you really want to sit here? I was thinking of closing up early today. And just every single situation that he gets into, every single stop on his book tour is worse than the one before. And then there's this larger thing in which mistaken identity and confusion is getting him deeper and deeper into trouble, and he kind of doesn't realize it. You as the readers realize it. This book is very funny. It's dark, but it's not pitch black or anything like that. It's black comedy. But a lot of this comedy just takes place in exchanges. It's not action set pieces. It's just conversation, and you can see it. It's like a dark comedy version of when you watch. I'm trying to think about what a good example would be. We watched a show, The Night Off, and the first episode is about a particular crime being committed and then someone getting trapped. And the entire episode is about things that you can see are going to be problems later. You can see, oh, he put his fingerprints on that. Oh, he shouldn't have done that. It's that kind of thing. This entire book feels like that, where you can see what's happening. You're like, that is going to come back later as trouble. And that he shouldn't have said that. He shouldn't have put it that way when talking to the police, or this casual remark is going to be misinterpreted. Because you quickly understand, as the reader, you quickly understand the absurdity of the situation. You can predict the next thing before the clueless, hapless, really, protagonist can. And this makes this a completely different kind of noir fish out of water story, etc. I mean, they're usually out of their depth, but this is one of the most glorious examples I've seen of where you as a reader are predicting what's going to happen to them. You can kind of see what's coming and they can't, and you are getting a kind of sick entertainment from this while also feeling bad for him. You want to see what happens next. You enjoy his situation in an almost perverse manner, which I thought was magnificently manipulated by writer-artist Andy Watson. I really wish... I'm going to go back and see what Andy Watson stuff I've missed between Paris and Little Star and this one. But he should write more for grown-ups. I can see this being... like one of the best books I read this year because of how, or the year it came out, because of how potent its comedy is and how cringy you feel. I mean, it doesn't matter whether something is science fiction or whether something is crime or something like that. It's got to reach out to the page and get you to have the reaction it wants you to have. And I think there are so many comics that we've talked about today that do that make you feel this pathos, that put you into people's shoes. Non-fiction, does that in a way. Good non-fiction does that in a way that's absolutely transportive. Good science fiction does that in a way that's absolutely transportive. But this, I think, of all the books that I read in this bunch, and they were all good, this is my favorite because I couldn't stop squirming at what was going on, and still was excited to see what was coming up next. So that's The Book Tour by Andi Watson. Highly, highly recommended. Parenthesis by Élodie Durand. Highly, highly recommended. Oops. The Delicacy, highly, highly recommended. They Called Us Enemy, highly recommended. And I'll have to get back to you about this. But given how much I enjoyed these 5, oh, and KODI. I must have put KODI back there. And KODI by Jared Cullum, also highly recommended. So it's fantastic. If you get 6 books in the mail, you think it'll be great if I could, if I like 2 of them, or if I like 3 of them. The fact that I've enjoyed 5 out of these 6, and probably the beginning of the 6th is also something I was enjoying. It's a great hit ratio. I really wish that I would do more to encourage such behavior from publishers, and I would probably need to make videos faster than 1 year after I get a box in order to have that happen. But I'm glad that I was able to get to these books, and I was glad that I was able to use this as an excuse to talk about, all of the top shelf comics that I could find on my shelves right now. In fact, I had them up there on the top shelf for the thumbnail photograph, and I thought I would go back and forth throughout this video. Thank goodness I didn't attempt that. But there might be other top shelf comics on my shelves that I missed, and I'm definitely going to take a look at what they've been publishing between 2015, which is apparently when the Nemo box set, that's the last thing I owned between 2015 and right now. And these 6 books hopefully should not be out of print, unlike a lot of the others. And take a look at them. I had a fantastic time reading these comics. Actually, I didn't expect to enjoy every single one of them as much as I did, and they were all different from each other. And thank you so much, Top Shelf Comics, for sending me this. Sorry I was late, but that's all I have for today. Thank you everyone for sticking around for this video. I hope you enjoyed this nice meaty live stream talking about a whole bunch of books, and I'll probably be back with a shorter video on, edited without so much rambling and meandering pretty soon, although I make no promises. But whenever that is, I'll see you then in the next video. Thank you so much. Have a good night, good day, rest of the Sunday wherever you are, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.